done. You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it's 3 years since the J report revealed the horrific scale of sexual exploitation of children in the South Yorkshire town of Rotherham. Over the course of 15 years, more than 1,400 children, some as young as 11, were subjected to trafficking, rape and torture by gangs of men who were predominantly of Pakistani origin, while the police and the authorities failed to act. The report was seen by many as a watershed moment in changing how authorities would deal with abuse. But was it? The BBC's social affairs correspondent Alison Holt has reported many times on the Rotherham grooming scandal and has now returned to the town for a special report for this programme. Before we talk to Alison, I should warn you that you may find some of the details of her film upsetting. It's really not suitable if you have children at home for the holidays. So, Alison, tell us first of all, what did you find when you returned to Rotherham?
Well, 3 years ago this week, when the scandal first emerged, the stories we were hearing were about children ignored, about professionals who tried to warn of what was going on being sidelined, and of information not shared. There has been progress since then, but worryingly, what I found was that there were still cases which seemed to show just how difficult it is to change some deep-rooted attitudes.
They kidnapped her, they'd held her hostage, they'd made a drug run, gun run, anything.
Rotherham in South Yorkshire is a town trying to emerge from the darkest of times.
They had her like a puppet, and they manipulated for their own benefit, and then mentally, physically and sexually abused her.
It's 3 years since Rotherham found itself at the heart of one of Britain's biggest child abuse scandals. More than 1,400 children sexually exploited by gangs for over a decade. The authorities who'd ignored the problem promised change, but how much has really happened?
There are people who've been perpetrated against who think they have reported it and it's not been dealt with. It's just been put away in a drawer and left.
The people of South Yorkshire need proper protection, and we need to know that mistakes from the past have been learned.
And for the first time, the whistleblower who helped expose the abuse tells of the treatment that's torn her life apart.
Here we are, nearly 3 years on, and I feel more vilified than some of the perpetrators in Rotherham.
They were raped by multiple perpetrators. They were trafficked to other towns and cities in the north of England. They were abducted, beaten and intimidated.
In 2014, a report by Professor Alexis Jay exposed the failure by the council and police in Rotherham to tackle the gangs of men of largely Pakistani heritage who were exploiting children.
This is when she was only a few months old.
There are some families for whom the lifelong cost of a problem ignored is only now becoming clear.
This is in the garden playing.
This is Gemma. As a tiny baby, her mother, unable to cope, gave her to Julie and Malcolm Roberts to bring up.
Everybody liked Gemma. She'd mix with anybody. We just thought she was a normal kid, and laughing and joking. She was lovely. She was.
This is when she was about 4.
This is the first time the couple have talked about their foster daughter and the difficulties that started at an early age.
She was a very troubled and a child that you couldn't reason with. A child that, no matter what you said to her, she tried to get attention, whether it were good or bad. She was doing really stupid things, putting herself in danger, to the point where she wanted to throw herself off the railway lines.
At 11, Gemma was moved to a children's home, taken into care by Rotherham Council. Now closed, this is one of the places where she was preyed on by men who claimed to be her boyfriend.
It sounds like they plighted her with money, goods, then drugs, And once they've got hold of you with drugs, then every bit of your money that you get isn't your money. So you're owing to them all the time. And that's how it was. The incidents that she told me of, they'd kidnapped her, they'd held her hostage, they'd made a drug run, gun run, anything.
On the streets of Rotherham, she was increasingly trapped in a world of violence and abuse. Pregnant at 16, her baby was taken into care. She did try to get help from the authorities, but got nowhere.
I knew that she was on the game. She was prostituting in Sheffield. And I know that with her arms that she was on drugs. And I did say to her, Gemma, I will be having a phone call and I will be hearing you, either a punter's got hold of you or you're on the slab in the morgue.
Some questions to that. Thank you.
But when Professor J told the world about the abuse in Rotherham for the first time, Gemma began to tell her foster parents about what had happened to her.
Gemma said, Mum, she says, I'm one of them girls. I'm one of them that have been abused by these people. I asked her why didn't she speak to me beforehand when things were going off. She says, I'd informed the police, the social services knew about it. Why should I come and upset you, Mum? Why should I have trouble at your door?
She began to talk to the National Crime Agency about what happened to her as a child. But now in her 30s, she was still preyed on by some of the same abusers. When her foster parents were also threatened, they called 999.
The perpetrators that had got Gemma hooked on drugs and lending her money, manipulating her, were coming to the door, threatening with guns. These were all logged down, took crime incident numbers. Police didn't come on 2 occasions, they came on 1.
So all since the J report?
Oh yeah.
All after the publicity about exploitation?
Yeah, all after that.
All after the promises that things would change?
Yeah, exactly. And like she felt, and like I felt, that she wasn't listened to.
South Yorkshire police say they haven't been able to identify the specific incidents, but will work with Gemma's family. Jane Sr. first met Gemma when she was a teenager. Then she was manager of Risky Business, a charity which helped exploited children.
She couldn't protect herself. They had a full hold on her, you know, as they did lots of the children that we were working with.
These days, she works for a small charity called Swinton Lock, a community activity centre. It also provides support for vulnerable adults.
January this year, the phone rang at work, and when I answered it, a little voice says, "Can you remember me?"
Like others, Gemma needed support, the sort of call Jane Sr. gets regularly.
It's still happening, you know. And I have had a couple of calls and from people in the community, oh, this is still happening to their children or their daughters, and just reaching out and asking for help and support because they're just feeling like parents did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago. Frightened, worried, upset, lonely, isolated.
Abuse survivors also give information like names, phone numbers and car details. The charity was sending this to the council, expecting it to be passed on to the police. Mike Fowler is on the Swinton Lock Management Committee. He's also a former detective.
Well, the intelligence builds up a picture, and although small pieces of it might not be the right kind of information that could be turned into evidence, there could be a string of those that would form, you know, the full jigsaw puzzle, and they would be able to catch a perpetrator.
The charity claims some of the information it sent in was not passed to the National Crime Agency.
There are people who've been perpetrated against or think they have reported it, and it's not being dealt with. It's just been put away in a drawer and left. and that information is a mixture of historical information from the victims and current information as well. The current information is quite appalling, actually.
So information that could potentially stop crimes which are happening now?
Yeah.
Rotherham Council denies this, saying its records show information was passed to the NCA in a timely way and in line with agreed protocols. But this is not the only battle with the council. Jane Senior, who's received an MBE from the Queen for her work, helped expose the abuse that was ignored for so long in Rotherham. For 12 months now, she's been under investigation by Rotherham Council after a complaint by a number of abuse survivors. The first she heard of it was when a journalist called.
I was quite shocked, actually, and I think the complaints received, then investigate it. I don't have a problem with that. But I shouldn't have had to find out off a journalist.
Have you ever been given clear details about what you're under investigation for?
No, never.
So it's never been clearly set out?
No.
You've never had point 1, point 2?
No, not at all.
She believes she's accused of making money from media appearances and of inappropriately sharing confidential information. Last November, council officials interviewed her for 5 hours.
I would ask lots of questions about how much money I'd earned. I was asked questions about who I was sharing information with, who I'd pass that information on, had I got people's permission to share it.
One of the accusations is that you've made lots of money from doing interviews, from writing a book, from talking about what's happened in Rotherham. What's your reaction to that?
It devastates me. I do not receive money for doing interviews. The only interview that I received a small amount of money for has gone to Swinton Lock. I don't and have not done this for money. Somebody told them that I was earning a significant amount of money. Well, I'm not.
The interview wasn't the end of it. Council officials arrived at the Swinton Lock charity unannounced.
What was the first you knew?
When they came through the door and introduced themselves.
About 7 officials were met by the charity's administrator, Sharon Cook. She was told it was a monitoring visit and was quickly asked for personnel files.
They were looking for specific information, particularly with Jane's, relating to her salary and to her pay.
How do you know that?
Because I keep my files in a very tight order. Everything's popped away. When I came back into them, there were particular documents left out.
We have policies and procedures here to deal with allegations. They've deliberately bypassed those. Even when we've asked them to stop, it just seems as though, you know, they want to attack Jane's character and discredit the work she's done.
As a whistleblower?
As a whistleblower.
Given Rotherham's history, the council has to make sure it investigates all complaints thoroughly. But the question being raised here is about the length of time it's taken.
I've seen murder inquiries wrapped up well before then. It's just appalling the way we've been treated. We are a small charity, we are not major criminals.
Rotherham Council says it has a duty to robustly and fairly consider complaints. It's appointed independent investigators and can't comment further. But Jane Senior says the year-long investigation has taken its toll.
Here we are, nearly 3 years on, and I feel more vilified than some of the perpetrators in Rotherham.
That's how you feel at the moment? You feel vilified?
Absolutely, yeah.
These have been difficult years for Rotherham, but there have also been significant successes, gaining some justice for abuse survivors.
They've shown incredible bravery, reliving vicious and traumatic events for the courts that for many of these young women completely shattered their lives.
At 3 major trials, 19 people involved in exploiting children in the town were given long jail terms. The names of the ringleaders were very familiar to Dr. Angie Heal. They were included in the report she wrote for South Yorkshire Police in the early 2000s, which were sent to senior officers.
I was detailing some of the cases that were taking place. I was making it very, very clear that these were organised criminals that were abusing children in Rotherham and elsewhere in South Yorkshire as well.
There are 88 ongoing investigations into how police officers handled these cases, but Dr. Heal wants to know why still none of the highest ranking officers have had to account for their decisions.
We've had at least 1,400 children over a 13-year period, probably much more, sexually exploited. We've now had, in the past 18 months, at least 19 offenders convicted and sentenced to nearly 300 years between them. And yet we have not had the senior command team properly investigated for what went wrong on their watch during that time. And that really concerns me.
Certainly for at least one of those 1,400 sucked into a violent world as a child, too little seemed to have changed. Gemma Roberts was still talking to the National Crime Agency, but her family say she struggled to cope with the memories.
She went into drugs more severely because she tried to blank things out of her mind. It was upsetting her. She was wetting the bed. She was in a very bad mental state.
In January, she was living in supported housing here in Rotherham. She was getting limited help, but the abuse didn't stop.
She'd been involved with these guys with drugs and running with drugs and got her that deep into it that for whatever reason, there's no reason, she got raped by 6 Asian men.
Nearly a month later, the police still hadn't taken her statement. Soon after, she was found dead from a morphine overdose. Unable to escape her abusers, her death a tragic symbol of the importance of learning from the past.
They were still there from the care system, still there till she died at 35, and they're still there now, out on the streets. These, I won't call them men, these perpetrators are still out there.
Well, Chloe, terribly sad story, Gemma's story. And I should say that both South Yorkshire Police and Rotherham Council have apologised for past failings. And in Gemma's case, they send their condolences, say they're saddened by her tragic death. South Yorkshire Police say there are many crimes which her family mentioned, and that all reported incidents involving Gemma have been thoroughly investigated and finalised, and that they take all incidents involving guns, firearms extremely seriously. In terms of the concerns raised by Dr. Heal, South Yorkshire Police point to a report written for the Police and Crime Commissioner, Dr. Alan Billings, which said that considerable lessons had been learned and significant improvements made. It's also worth saying that the National Crime Agency, which deals with most of the historic cases of abuse, says that it is satisfied that all information relevant to its investigations have been shared with it. Now, moving on to Jane Senior's case, since we contacted the council, she has now received details, written details of the accusations that she faces. We have spoken to a survivor of abuse who did not want to take part in the programme at this time. I want to emphasise something on this, which I think is really important, and that is that after all that happened in Rotherham and in other places, it is vital, it is essential that people who are facing exploitation and abuse feel able to complain and know that it will be investigated thoroughly. So that's not where the concerns lie here. The investigators will have to weigh up the allegations that are made and decide the rights and wrongs of that. That's their job. But what we're looking at here is the process, and we now know that the local government, or we understand that the local government ombudsman will be looking at the handling of Jane Senior's case, the way in which Rotherham Council has dealt with it. Now, Rotherham is certainly not the only place where they've had problems with exploitation. We've heard of problems in Rochdale, most recently in Newcastle, where 19 people were convicted about 10 days ago. So I think that underlines the significance of the problem across the country, but also the difficulties of tackling it.
Thank you ever so much for doing that film for us, and we'll be talking about this later on. That's the BBC's social affairs correspondent, Alison Holt. Well, as we've seen in our report, the authorities who had ignored the problem promised change. But 3 years on, how much has really changed? We're joined now by Dr Alan Billings, the Police and Crime Commissioner for South Yorkshire, Nazir Afzal, the former Chief Crown Prosecutor for the North West, whose work led to the Rochdale grooming prosecutions, and Anita Prem, human rights activist for Charity Freedom, who work in educating children and teenagers on sex and sexual exploitation. Thank you all for joining us. Anita, I want to start with you because anybody watching that film is going to see what a harrowing story Gemma's story was, just one story. Is this kind of abuse still going on now?
Unfortunately it is. This abuse is not unique, and Gemma's death can't be in vain. The fact that she reported this, the fact that she wasn't listened to, and I think it's really important that senior officers that were there at the time are made accountable for what happened. And I think it's very important when a young person or anybody come forward to report this type of horrific case, where you're looking about people being trafficked, raped and tortured, that they are taken seriously and there is a complete chain of command, that we know exactly what's going on, that it can't be hidden away. And too many of these cases are. Nottingham, you know, less than 2 weeks ago, that case as well. There are many, many cases out there.
We will talk about police failings and looking back, but let's look forward for a moment if we can, Dr Billings. Do you think the police are changing the way they view these people? There was a time before the J report they were almost seen as willing participants, these young girls, now being seen as victims?
I think that's the big change, that one of the first things I did when I became Police and Crime Commissioner was to set up a panel of victims, survivors as they prefer to call themselves mainly, and their families, so that I could learn about grooming, what it was, why it happened, and where the police failures were, and then introduce them to the police, which has happened in South Yorkshire. So they've been dealing directly with victims themselves, and they've been influencing the training that they have. And we've done lots of things. We've brought agencies together now, so they're all located in one place. So you've got the local authority, the NHS, Barnardo's and the police all in the same building, able to share information. And of course, crucially in South Yorkshire, there have been these prosecutions because 1,400 girls, offenders are out there, they need to be brought to justice, and that's beginning to happen. So 5 very big trials with very big sentences. That sends out a very important message in South Yorkshire.
Nazir, do you think enough is being done to protect vulnerable people right now?
Good morning, Chloe. Let me pay tribute to Dr Billings, because he inherited the situation in South Yorkshire, and he's tried to put things in place that will provide the victims with the voice that they deserve and they need. And my sense is, and I speak across the country knowing what's going on around the country, is there's a substantial amount of complacency here. We also recognise, surely we recognise there are massive resourcing issues. It's cost policing about £1 billion last year to investigate child sexual abuse across the board. That's going to go up and up and up over the next 3 or 4 years. There are massive issues for those charities, and Anita heads up one down south, but there are many in the north who just don't have the resources to provide the support for victims that they need day in, day out. I was talking to a survivor last night, actually, of Rotherham, and she said to me that she's really concerned that we're not dealing with the future. The future being, what about the future offenders? There's not enough going on in relation to young boys. There's not enough going on in relation to young girls and identifying what signs they should be looking for and what's available to them in terms of support. And additionally, my sense is that we're making progress, absolutely, and there are many cases going through the courts, but the courts don't have the capacity to deal with all the sizable amounts of work that's going their way. And so I think this is good progress. I feel like a stuck record. Good progress, but plenty more to do. And I think my other concern really is about what's happening within the communities themselves, because they took a real shock and quite rightly so, actually, back in 3 years ago when they learnt of this report and what was happening. And there was some sizable work that went on for a little while. And then when the cameras went away and the broadcasters moved on, all of that died down. It goes up again. I'm sure tomorrow there'll be sizable amounts of work going on for a little while. And again, the microscope leaves town and they end up moving on to other priorities. There is
I want to raise the issue because I think it's relevant that you've talked about looking forward. People will be familiar that last week Sarah Champion, the Rotherham MP, also Shadow Women and Equalities Minister, she resigned because she wrote in The Sun, and I'll remind people if they're not familiar with it, that Britain has a problem with British Pakistani men raping and exploiting white girls. There, I said it. Does that make me a racist, or am I just prepared to call out this horrifying problem for what it is? She then had to apologise, and I apologise, some people will find that offensive, but it's important that people know what she said. People got in touch with the BBC saying, she's calling this outright. She is right. Why is she having to resign? Anita, do you think that she was calling it outright? Was it inappropriate? Are we scared to talk about race in this context?
I think people are very nervous about talking about race. We know in this case that we're looking at today, the men came of Pakistani descent. We can't get away from that. But we can't say everybody from Pakistani descent, men, are perpetrators. We have to be really careful about that. But we need to look at education, and we need to go into schools, which we are doing at Freedom Charity, and talking to young men and young women about how they can report things sensibly and about women's rights and how girls can be respected and nurtured and cared for. And that's really, really important, that we look at the next generation and how this is going to be dealt with.
Is it a cultural problem, Nazir?
Well, I've spoken out on this subject several times, and what Sarah was saying is something that I've said. I wouldn't have said it without the context. We have to say that 80% of sex offenders in this country are white males, and they organise themselves in a different way. But when it comes to this type of area, street grooming, British Pakistani men are disproportionately involved. And, you know, Sarah's only echoing what I've said for the best part of 5 years. And no, she shouldn't have had to resign. My point is that we don't shoot the messenger if we don't like the message. And ultimately, this is an issue that we within the communities have to tackle. It's not just an issue for policing, it's not just an issue in terms of education. We've got to find the perpetrators amongst ourselves, we've got to identify those at risk of becoming perpetrators, and ultimately we've got to challenge them on what they do.
Dr. Billings, I want to ask you, because the whistleblower Jane Senior, who took part in our film, said she's been told by people that children are still being abused. Are you actively pursuing investigations into claims right now about children being abused in Rotherham?
Well, of course, South Yorkshire Police are dealing with all the current cases of abuse, and there are lots of them. I think over 100 are currently being investigated at the moment by South Yorkshire Police. Some of the things you're talking about are non-recent cases of CSE. They're investigated as well, but the National Crime Agency are doing that in South Yorkshire, in Rotherham. So you've got 117 detectives from the National Crime Agency actively at work in Rotherham, pursuing those non-recent cases. Now, at the moment, they haven't been able to bring anything to trial, because to get these things to trial, if they're non-recent, you've got no forensic evidence. You're completely dependent on what the victims say in court, what the witnesses say in court.
And so it takes time to
And getting these vulnerable people and wrapping the care around them, bringing them to court, educating the prosecution, the CPS, Nazir will know all about that, and educating judges as well as to how you conduct a case where there may be one victim, their witnesses, and perhaps 9 barristers for the defendants are all having their aggressive questions at the victims. It's not an easy job to do.
I want to ask you one more question before we leave this story, because I think it's important, and many people who followed this story will want to know this. There has been criticism that none of the senior members of your force were cleared by the IPCC. Why haven't more senior officers been held responsible for what some people would say are quite clear failings?
Yes, I understand I mean, a lot of people ask that question in South Yorkshire. It seems as if the senior leadership can get away with these things, but the more junior members of the force, you mentioned in your report, the IPCC are currently looking at some of those. I mean, these are very difficult things to investigate. It takes a lot of resource to do it, and I don't know whether too much time has now gone by. But there are people currently being investigated by the IPCC. I criticise the length of time that's taking, because I think if people have done things that were wrong, we should know about that, the public should know about that, the victims should know about that. but they also need, some of those will be exonerated. They need to be cleared because that's hanging over them as well. So it's a very complex and difficult situation in South Yorkshire.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm very grateful to you. If you have been affected by any of the issues we've covered, there is more information on the BBC Action Line. The number is 0800 888 809. Calls are free and are open 24 hours a day. And there's a full list of support and organisations available at bbc.co.uk/actionline.